Now this morning we're going to be continuing to read in the Gospel of Luke. We're going to move on to Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 15. And if you've been here for the past couple of weeks, we've been reading Luke 14 and 13. You'll find that these chapters in Luke, they speak a lot about wealth and money and resources, things like that. We'll see that theme continue today in Luke 16, and we'll also read a little bit of the letter of 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 24. And so again, my friends, today our scriptures tell us, beginning with Luke 16, that Jesus told his disciples that there was a rich man whose manager or steward was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called the manager in and asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management to me, because you cannot be my steward any longer." And so the manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, "And how much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, "Take your bill, and make it 800. And then the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth in order to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." The Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is actually detestable in the sight of God." Moving on to the letter of 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 24. Again, our scriptures tell us that this is how we know what love is. That Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and our sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or with speech, but with actions and in truth. This is how we know that we belong to the truth, and how we set our hearts at rest in his presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, then we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask, because we keep his commands and do what pleases him. And this is his command: to believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as he commanded us. The one who keeps God's commands lives in him, and he in them, and this is how we know that he lives in us. We know it by the Spirit that he gave us. Thanks be to God for these scriptures that have been given to us this morning. We pray this again in the name of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to our God. Amen. Well, my friends, I don't know how many of you are already very familiar with this story, sometimes called the parable of the shrewd manager or the dishonest steward. Now, this story actually comes up once every 3 years in the lectionary readings. That's the traditional calendar of Bible passages that many churches use to decide what scriptures to read or to preach on from week to week. It's in a 3-year cycle. But even though this parable shows up once every 3 years on the lectionary calendar, it's not often a very popular story for people to read. Many times pastors might choose one of the other lectionary passages, or they might choose something else entirely, because we have to admit this story is just a little bit weird. A little bit different than many of Jesus' other parables. Now, I know that whenever we read parables from Jesus, I think many times we have this temptation to try and pick out in our minds, who are the major characters here? Is there a character in this story who somehow represents God? Am I learning something about God in this parable? Or is there a character in this story that Jesus is lifting up as a righteous example, that this is a good example to imitate in your life, teaching us some divine truth? And maybe we're tempted, when we read the parable of the dishonest manager, to perhaps superimpose the image of God onto the rich master in the story, the big man in charge, the powerful guy. But is there anything about the rich master that actually reminds you about God? Is there anything divine about this man who simply wanted to fire his steward because he heard he wasn't doing a very good job, and then changed his mind and decided to keep him on his staff because of how clever he was? Or do we hope to see an example of a righteous person, of a holy life to imitate, in the actions of the dishonest steward, the man who, when he found out he was losing his job, he suddenly decided to call in all of his master's debtors and kind of cook the books a little bit, cancel some of the debts, to try and make friends before he was thrown out on the street? Now remember that Jesus himself called this steward dishonest, and then he went on to say that whoever is dishonest with very little is going to be dishonest with much and cannot be trusted with more. So who are we supposed to look up towards in this story? Who is teaching us the moral that we're supposed to learn or to imitate? Well, unfortunately, my friends, I think we're somewhat forced to struggle a little when we read this parable. To struggle with the fact that there are no truly righteous examples in this story. That this is a very real story about very real people. What would worldly people do in this kind of situation? And yet, even though this is a story about unjust or selfish characters, Jesus still seems to think that this parable is going to teach us about something divine. Particularly, teach us a divine lesson about how we use or about how we think about our money. Now, I personally really love that line that Jesus uses later on in this text when he says to the Pharisees that the people of this world are in fact more shrewd in dealing with one another and managing their wealth than are the people of the light, or the children of the light. That somehow people who are accustomed to acting selfish or greedy or corrupt with their finances, somehow those people exhibit a certain degree of craftiness or shrewdness with their wealth That many people who value other things more than money sometimes neglect. But of course, why would Jesus want to teach us about how to be clever with our money? It seems like a kind of strange lesson from the Savior. After all, don't the Scriptures tell us elsewhere that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil? Don't we want to be rid of that unhealthy love in our lives, that unhealthy addiction, to yank it out like a weed and to be rid of it? And maybe that is one of the lessons we need to learn about money today. And yet at the same time, I'm also reminded of another sermon when I read this text. Another sermon that was preached for the first time in 1959. Originally by the Reverend Dr. King Martin Luther Jr. I messed his name up there, but you know what I'm trying to say. And in that sermon, Dr. King once preached about the idea of what he called, as disciples of Christ living in this world, how to live as if you have a tough mind and a gentle heart. Now, Dr. King's message was based upon Matthew 10:16, when Jesus once said to his disciples that, "Therefore, I am sending you out into the world like sheep among wolves. Therefore, become as shrewd as snakes and as harmless as doves." And the gist of Dr. King's message was this. He said that when the world is filled with evil, crafty people around us who are always trying to manipulate the situation for their benefit, as disciples, we have to learn how to be wise, even proactive in the way that we deal with the world. Otherwise, we might easily fall into habits or behaviors. We might easily be tricked into imitating some of their selfish patterns. Or we might actually become the abused in society. If we are easily taken advantage of, if we don't defend ourselves, if we aren't clever with how we express the love of Christ, then we might easily become those who are oppressed. And so perhaps maybe in Luke chapter 16, Jesus was also teaching his disciples that we should be shrewd, clever, or proactive about how we choose to use our wealth, how we choose to spend our money. Because otherwise it can be very easy to imitate how other people manage their money around us. It can be very easy to become in bondage to the power of money, or to be lulled into ways of using our money that are actually evil or corrupt or selfish. Or if we try to throw money out of our lives, if we try to avoid its evil so much, we might become so impoverished that we are abused, neglected, or destitute. Even though Jesus preached against wealth in certain places in the Gospels, Jesus never taught us that money is an inherently evil thing. He never said that you want to dispose of your money, that you want to throw it all away, or somehow avoid earning an income and managing it well. But instead, he taught us to be aware of the fact that money has power. That money sometimes has the power to confuse or distort things about the world, to confuse our minds about what is actually important and what isn't. Or, as Jesus said elsewhere, many times the rich have the hardest time with the gospel. Or Jesus warned us that we become so focused on the temporary value and worth of our money that we forget the eternal value of other things around us, like the relationships and the people that we spend time with in this world. But I also believe that in this particular gospel lesson, Jesus is also reminding us that our money has instrumental power, that it has the power to actually do good, that your wealth, in a sense, represents part of your ability to reach out and to help people, to love others. Perhaps one of the most common ways that we can use our money for good in the world is by using our wealth to take care of the people we love. But maybe another good use of our money, as demonstrated by the dishonest manager in the parable, is the way that steward, when he was acting very selfishly, he suddenly decided to use his power, his position in his master's household, to actually call in all the people who were suffering financial burdens or who were in debt or oppressed. And he used his wealth to forgive them, to release them from bondage, to bless them with his power. But again, at the same time, maybe one of Jesus' points is that regardless of his intentions, even though the man was being dishonest, the actions he was doing were good. Using your wealth to bless other people, to release them from debt, to show love to them, even if they're strangers, is not a waste of money. My friends, I think perhaps one of the most basic questions that we might be able to ask ourselves in light of this story is, how am I using my money to bless other people, if I'm using it at all? Now, I don't happen to think that Jesus is telling us that we ought to frivolously spend our money, to throw it away on others, to give it all away, to spend all our money on doing fun things with people or providing for them. But again, he encourages us to be shrewd with our money, to be clever and wise with it, so that we are not left destitute. But he is also asking us, do you spend your money on valuable relationships in this world? Do you use your money and value people? Or do you value your money and use people? Or perhaps even more than that, do you only spend your money on your close circle of family or friends? Do you only invest in the people that you immediately care about? Or do you ever even use your wealth to reach out to new people? I love the way Jesus says, use your wealth to gain friends. Don't just spend your money on the people you already love, but try to love more people. When you see someone in need and you feel called, try to help them out. And who knows what kind of new connections you might be making. Now, I want us to take a step back here for just a moment to talk about money itself for a little bit longer. Because there is this underlying theme in this text of strenuously trying to avoid an unhealthy love of money. Later on in the Bible, it tells us that the Pharisees loved their money, and therefore they had trouble with this lesson from Jesus that you cannot love both God and money. Now, that seems kind of like a strange thing to us. It seems so intuitively obvious. How could they not tell that you can't love both God and money? Wouldn't the Pharisees be able to see how those two powers were in conflict? But I want to cut the Pharisees a little bit of slack this morning, try and help you understand their perspective a little bit. Because you know what, in their historical context, many people in the first century, in fact, we can see it all over the Old Testament as well. We can see this viewpoint in the Hebrew Bible, especially like in the book of Job and other places. In those days, there was a very common belief that good fortune and good wealth corresponded with a holy lifestyle. In other words, there was a feeling among people, maybe not even so different from today, a feeling that if you are a good and you are a righteous person, and if you have things right with God, you are going to become wealthy and healthy. God is going to take care of you. That wealth is actually a sign that something is going very right in your life. And you know what? Jesus even addresses this idea a little bit, the way people trust in the power of wealth. When he talked about riches in this story, it's not very clear in the English Bible, but actually if we turn to the Greek in this story, whenever Jesus talks about riches or wealth or money, the word he is using in Greek is mammonos, a very common term in the New Testament to talk about riches or worldly wealth. But I think it's actually very interesting that the word mammonos in the Greek actually derives from the Aramaic and the Hebrew words, which literally mean to trust. or to trust in one's treasure. So when Jesus says money, he's actually talking about trusting in your treasure. And that reminds me of another story also. Another story I think I've shared in another sermon here before, about when I was a college student at Eastern Illinois University. I had a philosophy professor one time who made a kind of offhanded comment to his students. And it's a line that's always stuck in my head from that day. And this particular philosophy professor, he was talking about religious belief among Americans, and he told us that, you know what, most Americans are actually very clear about the God that they worship and they value with their actions, if not their words. And he said it's not surprising what God they worship. It's printed right there on their money, where it says, "In God we trust." Now, many of us, when we might read that line on a dollar bill or on a coin, we might think, oh, what a wonderful celebration of God the Father. But isn't it ironic how many people actually treat, on a daily basis, they actually treat their money as if it were their God? And isn't it interesting that Jesus also uses that word to describe money, trusting in your treasure? And certainly that's one of the most toxic dangers of money that Jesus is addressing in this text, an unhealthy amount of trust in its power. But on the other hand, Jesus is not telling us this story to simply convince us that we ought to get rid of our money, that we ought to stop earning it, that we ought to throw it away and avoid it as some unhealthy and evil object. He isn't saying that money is so inherently bad that you should never use it. But instead, he's telling us that as children of the light, we need to proactively put our money in its place. That as children of God, we should not be tempted to let our money define our feelings of what is valuable or important. That we can use our money, that we can earn it, and actually put it to good use, to accomplish good things in the world. And perhaps one of the ways that we can tell that maybe we've become a little tempted or confused by the power of money in our lives is to ask ourselves questions. Questions like, how much am I actually willing to use my wealth for others? How often am I willing to use my money to bless another person? How do I feel about my money? Does having money make me feel powerful? Does it make me feel good? Does it make me feel secure? Or when I think about my money, do I just see it as a tool, like any other? A tool to take care of me and my family, and a tool to actually practice love towards friends and strangers and acquaintances. My friends, what is money to you? And what is its value? I'll leave those questions with you this morning as we turn to God in prayer. Oh God, once again we've come to you today as people who do not want our lives or actions confused by the power of money. But God, I ask that you will help us to be willing to actually use our money to accomplish good things, to love others, to build relationships. God, help us to have open hearts and open hands. Help us to know the power of generosity and of sharing what we have. Help us to be clever and shrewd in the ways that we use this very, very powerful tool. God, help us to have a tough mind and a gentle heart. We pray this again in the name of Jesus Christ. Thanks be to our God.